Reading in my life is relaxation. You feel better afterwards.
Hello and welcome to Sendoku. Now, today we're celebrating because we've hit the big 4-0. I don't know if life fully begins at 40, but I know that my life where I hit 40 books was probably a million years ago. So, this is the podcast for all of you who are clocking up the thousands. I'm Sarah Martin.
And I'm Annie Hastwell.
So today we've got a couple of great interviews to bring you. I've spoken with Fiona Lowe, Australian author, prolific Australian author, about her latest book, The Accident, that's set in rural WA and starts with the crash.
And I have picked up a book called Suddenly Single at 60 with a champagne flute on the front. Now, I have to say it didn't look like my sort of book, but once I started reading it, it was very hard to put down. Jo Peck is the author. She had worked in advertising. It's her own story of being dumped by her husband of 25 years and what happened next.
Now, Fiona Lowe has written so many different books. She started in romance fiction, but she's moved through into sort of more topical and sort of, you wouldn't say mystery, but there's a tension in her books now. She likes to choose an idea and follow it through. And that's what she's done in her latest book, The Accident. Now, it does begin with a car crash. I'm not breaking any spoilers here. I think it's on the blurb. But what happens from there is the implications for a small town and small community, and particularly around two women. One, the man who was in the crash's fiancé, and the other, her best friend. And it explores what we do and don't know about the people who are closest to us, and from a perspective of friendship, from a perspective of family. But then it sort of delves off further into reproductive rights and the rights of a woman, but also the rights of the child to be. And it's really curious the way that it rolls out. Fiona told me that there's some complexities around writing this book because she set it in rural WA, doesn't live there. And she discovered it through driving through the countryside. And I just started by asking her about whether she can read while she's in a car, because there's a lot of hours to kill on those long country roads.
I'm an absolute audiobook addict. When I calculated my Goodreads thing, I just put it up as a bit of a history as for me, and I look at, and I think I edged into 55% audiobooks last year. I'm not a music person, so if I'm gardening, cooking, cleaning, and also I'm a woman of a certain age, so 3 o'clock in the morning, audiobook is a really good way to go back to sleep.
Look, hot tips for hot women.
Exactly right.
Now, you're here to talk about your latest book.
Yeah.
How many books have you written?
My back catalogue, because I've been published for 18 years, is 37.
Oh, my goodness.
But I've
Fiona.
changed direction 3 times in my writing career.
But that makes sense in terms of following your interests and not getting bored or stale.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I started, I fell into writing romance because I heard that they read all your submissions. But I really didn't come from a romance reading background. I had Pride and Prejudice. That was about it. And so I started writing medical romance because they said, right, well, I knew all the medical stuff and that all fascinated me and the people fascinated me, but I really struggled to get the romance bit right. And then I finally nailed it and I got published. And by about 10 books, I really discovered I had new writing muscles that wanted to be flexed. And I wanted to concentrate more on the other parts. I kept getting into trouble because they're saying this is the romance, Fiona, you're not all the secondary characters. So now I'm writing books. They've still got relationships in them, and what I learnt writing the romance is really valuable for this. But now I get to range far and wide because my background was in community health nursing and family support and a sexual health counsellor. I write about current contemporary social issues that all of us experience. And so when you read my books, you'll discover someone in your family, perhaps you or someone down the road who's been through what my characters go through.
The Accident is set in a small town not far from Perth.
About 90 minutes from Perth. It's a fictitious York in the wheat belt. I fell in love with York on a holiday driving through. I only spent 2 hours there. And I took lots of photos and thought that I'd set the book in Western Australia because I did need a bit of isolation. But it turned out to be a bit more challenging than I thought because a bit like Tassie, language is different in Western Australia. The flora's different.
And so it starts with an accident. Everything hinges around this one moment. You tell us your synopsis of the
Okay,
accident.
well, basically, from the outside, the brief synopsis is that the accident's about two couples. The blokes have been best friends since kindergarten, and the women are very close friends. And they've got their lives all planned out, and they're really looking forward to a wedding. And then an accident turns their lives upside down and leaves them questioning everything they believed about each other and everything that they believed about themselves.
Yeah, it really does show how perhaps people who think they're close don't know one another very well.
Exactly. And there's a few big themes I wanted to explore. And the first one was is how well do we ever really know anyone? And I've got to this age in my life where I believe we only know people as well as they choose to reveal themselves to us. We can hide an inordinate amount. And I'm a pretty open book. And women in general, we like to bond. We like to bond emotionally, and we tell each other stories. That's all part of the process. And so best friends, especially women, tend to believe that we know everything about each other. And when something comes out that is, and especially in an intimate relationship, that doesn't match up with the person that we thought we knew, or is information we didn't know at all, we automatically turn it around to ourselves, make it all about us, and we say, well, don't they trust us? Why didn't they tell us? Or even worse, if they didn't tell us that, are there other things they're not telling us? And there's family secrets. This isn't in the book, but for instance, we have an acquaintance who went to his father's funeral, and a great aunt who he hadn't seen for in a million years came up to him at the funeral and said, so you're going to try and find your real father? And at 53, he had no idea he'd been adopted.
Knocks the wind out of you.
Yeah. And so then when something big comes out like that, you start to say, well, was my life real? Was our relationship fake? What was real and what wasn't? And if a person is alive, you can talk to them about it. But if they're dead, you've got the grief and the shock, and then you've got, well, I don't know what I had. It leaves you absolutely floundering.
Another theme is ethical stances. The reason people make decisions they make, the reasons that they take a stand on a particular issue, and the complexities around the impact that has on friendships.
I wanted to look at motherhood in the 2020s. I wanted to explore, do women today really have a choice about motherhood? And I honestly don't think they have a massive choice. I think societal expectations upon us are inordinately huge. And only 12 years ago, we had a female Prime Minister who was child-free, and she was declared uncaring and selfish and a witch. And we have a Prime Minister not that long ago saying we should all be having 3 children. So you have this big pressure. Then you've got family pressure. I didn't suffer from it, but I can tell you from society, the moment I'd been married 2 years, people started saying, well, when are you having a baby? And I was one of these women that didn't know whether they wanted to have children or not. And I vacillated for about 7 years. And then when I finally decided that, yes, I probably could cope with 1, then I ran smack bang into infertility. So that plummeted me into a whole other ethical and moral dilemma as well. So, yeah, I think it's very hard. Plus, you've got judgment these days, a huge amount of judgment on mothers. We've got social media, we've got Instagram that paints this picture of what motherhood should be. It completely ignores arsenic hour from 5 to 7 when you're normally tearing your hair out. And we've become more nuclear. This takes a village to raise a child. I was raised like that. My children were raised like that. But I think these days it's harder to do that. You're alone often with your nuclear family. And these days, if you say to a kid, oi, don't do that, and it's not yours, you kind of get into trouble.
That work-life balance, there's the ideology that we can have it all, but the reality that we can't, and something's got to give. And that quite often women feel that there's a pressure that thing that gives shouldn't be children. Yet they get fulfillment and enjoyment out of all the other aspects of their life and feel like there's going to be a bigger loss from having to give one of those up.
Well, that's right. And also what I find interesting is that this automatic assumption, which is often said by men to women, is that, if you don't want children, you're selfish and uncaring. But normally women who are child-free are caring for family members, caring for elderly parents. They may be caring for other members inside their family, or they may be working in the caring profession. And I used to work in the caring profession. I have 2 sons who are doctors and a daughter-in-law who's a pharmacist who worked through COVID. And they're just exhausted. So it is a big decision. I think it takes a very strong person to do that. But the irony is that if a couple declare themselves to be child-free, I can tell you now that hardly anything's said to the bloke. but the woman is given a very hard time.
Your leading characters in The Accident are the women. We hear from them primarily, but you don't leave the men behind as well, and you give their unique perspective and relationships with these women a good amount of time, that it is not glib. Like you say,
no.
I feel like you've definitely looked into each individual character.
Well, that's right,
in
because
this
it's a
town.
book about relationships. It's a book
Yes.
about relationships of intimate partners, but also extended family,
Friends, family.
and the pressures that are put on women, because there's disappointment inside families as well if someone decides to be child-free. But then there's the people who want to have a child, and I wanted to explore when that driving need to have a child runs smack bang into the rights of a child. And again, people would say, you can have a child, that's the most important thing. Have a child any way you can. Maybe not. And that's why I wanted to delve into the moral and ethical dilemmas around posthumous sperm retrieval, because I think that is a huge thing. And there was a big media profile case with the Olympic snowboarder, but that couple was on IVF. They were actively trying to have a child. So that was a completely different scenario from what I've written about. So you've got a grief-stricken family who doesn't want to let go, and this opportunity, but you're in the weeds of grief when you have to make a decision, because there's a ticking clock. If someone dies, the sperm only lives for 48 to 72 hours. So there's a lot of legal hoops to jump through.
You'll get the sense that Fiona's written a page turner, and like I say, I ran through this book, didn't walk, because those sort of time factors in the way it's all playing out were of the essence. That pacing of this book is really nice. I mean, these kind of different plot elements that you weave in, slow friendships and family that are growing over time. You've got grief, which is interesting tale of its own and from many different perspectives. And then you've got this urgency in so many other ways.
That's right. And grief, when anyone who's been through grief will know that our brain just doesn't really function. When there's a shock, unexpected death, we really just shut down. We can't wrap our heads around that this person that, we kissed goodbye and going off to work this morning is not coming home. And so to have to then be making huge life-changing decisions under that sort of grief and surrounded by, a variety of different people and needing their help to do it, and they may or may not want to give their help. Yeah, it's really, really complicated.
When you write a book, do you hope that people take that kernel with them? And if they do, what do you want them to take from The Accident?
So all my books feature around a particular social issue. All 8 of them. I choose those, and I throw up all sorts of different questions. I don't make any judgments. I use my characters to reflect society of today. So they'll all have a different opinion, and I throw that all into the mix. And what I honestly hope is when someone finishes the book, that they get a little bit of a tiny book hangover, that my characters and the questions linger with them for, 24 hours before they pick up the next book. But also that if they go into the book with a particular preconceived idea about the topic, that perhaps by the end they may have considered that different opinions, because I've lived long enough now to know that life is very grey. We love to take a stand on either side of an issue, but really it's always complicated and it's always grey, and we can always see both sides. So that's what I hope always with my books.
I love that, Fiona. Thank you so much. It's been lovely of you to pop by in Adelaide. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful.
And I will be hopefully checking in with you next time around.
That would be great.
Because I loved it. This was a great book, and it was really thought-provoking. It ticked all the boxes. Like I say, I ripped through it because I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Fiona Lowe, she's the author of The Accident and many other books. So start with The Accident and then go for a nice deep dive. You're listening to Sundoku. Whether you like crime, romance fiction, or just can't get past your old pile of Agatha Christie's, we are the podcast for you.
And now to Suddenly Single at 60. What a story. Jo Peck was dumped by her husband of 25 years, and she's written a very brave memoir that takes the reader through the bombshell moment of discovery of what was going on, and then through some very, very dark moments of the soul, which she's very candid about, and onto a brave and ultimately successful survival. It's a story for anyone really who's plunged into an emotional trauma at any age, and it particularly challenges the stereotypes around older women and their lack of prospects if they should lose that comfortably coupled role. So in this interview, Jo Peck started by telling me about the day that she suggested to her husband, they were about to go shopping, and she suggested to her husband that they have a look at getting a new TV, and he reacted in a very strange way.
I was just totally unprepared for the violence of his reaction to an innocent question like that, which was, I'm so needy and why do we need a new TV? We've got 2 perfectly good TVs already. And just the way he reacted to that question made me think, that's a bit odd, something's wrong. And I said, no, it feels like it's more than just about a TV. And he went completely silent, and I realised that I had struck a nerve, and I realised in that moment what I might be about to hear. And he then said to me, I'm seeing someone else. And that came to me completely out of the blue. The first question I asked was, well, do you love her? And he said, in a way, yes, I do. And then I felt physically sick. I felt completely confused. I felt numb. I felt absolutely annihilated.
When you look back at that time, were there clues that you could have picked up on, do you think?
Yes, look, hindsight is a wonderful thing. And yes, I could have picked up on clues, but it was complicated by the fact that my husband suffered from depression. So there were always ups and downs and, quite violent mood swings in our relationship. And I had learnt to just live with those and to navigate those. And really, I thought, we were going through a patch where our communication wasn't great and my husband was quite remote. But I thought that they were also symptoms and typical of when he was in a depressive episode. So I put it down to that. But in this case, it was something more.
And I suppose when you say that he had always, had ups and downs, when you started to look back at the relationship clear-sightedly, not in the frame of mind where you were just trying to manage a slightly difficult man, you realised that, there were some serious problems with it.
Yes, there were. I had fallen into a dynamic with that man where he was quite controlling, and I became more and more submissive in that relationship. And submissive is not my natural state. And so when I look back at that, I think, how did I let that happen? I'm quite an intelligent person. I'm quite insightful, but I allowed myself to be controlled and dominated by that person. And when I look back at that, I think, well, it was my mistake as much as his. I should have stood up for myself. I should have claimed my rights in that marriage. Instead, I became, one of those women who walks around on eggshells and, does really anything to keep the peace.
And I suppose also at that moment or in the weeks that followed, you would have suffered a huge loss of identity because everything that you were planning and everything that you were was based on that relationship. Yeah,
look, I suffered a lot of loss, but the biggest thing for me was, well, who the hell am I in this world if I'm not that person's wife and we're not a couple? Where do I fit in? What's my future hold? That was the biggest thing. It was just not knowing how to be or who I would be as a single person, because we had become so entwined and dependent on each other. And, we were a we and I had no idea how to be an I. So that was the biggest adjustment for me.
Was there a moment when you started to see who you could be?
Yes, there was. It took quite a long time, and I had to put a lot of work into it. I kind of just got through those first months of feeling like a complete shell with the help of therapy and with the help of friends. My therapist said, look, I know you feel so devastated by this, but that you cannot imagine, how you can even function or get through a day. But she said, what you have to do is just do. Don't think, just do. So I started to just do things, even though, every bit of my soul didn't want to do anything except curl up in bed in a fetal position. I just had to begin to do things. And one of the first things I did was book myself into a yoga retreat with, some very good friends and a teacher I knew well. And it was going to Bali, which was a place I loved. And over there, I felt for the first time that, being a single wasn't so bad. I met a lot of strong, empowered women who had been through similar situations, and they gave me terrific advice. And I came back from that feeling like perhaps it was time I moved out on my own. I started to look for a place on my own. And, that was probably the first turning point. But, others came. It was, I didn't follow that I was just getting better and better. I would get a little bit better and then I would, regress. It just wasn't a straight line to healing. You'd have a few good days and then suddenly you would have, a shocking period of remembering the good times and think, about all the things you've lost. But there were definite points along the way where I did take a bit of a big leap forward.
One of the things about your book that really stands out is you're incredibly open about sex, and you write some fairly sexy passages of things that have happened to you. That's
Yes.
probably one of the things that you weren't expected by all the people around you to get back into.
It's not something I expected to get back into either. I thought, well, that's probably the end of intimacy for me. But it was one of those things that once I started I put myself online and I started, just broadening my understanding of how relationships might work in the world. It was a real eye-opener. And I'm quite a sexual person. So I opened myself up to those experiences and I thought, well, if I've been able to do this, I need to tell other women about it. I need to be honest and truthful and say, it's not the end of your intimate life just because you've reached a number. You've turned 60 and you're on your own. There's a lot out there. There's still a lot of potential and possibility out there if you're willing to be open to it. So I felt like I had a bit of an obligation to share that with, women of my age or women who are older or even women who are younger have come to me and said, look, I was uncoupled at 50 and I felt like that was it for me. But it wasn't, it doesn't have to be. It's all about your frame of mind and how open you can let yourself be.
Online dating sounds like quite an adventure. Can you run us through why you think, who's out there on the other side looking for someone who is 60?
It was an eye-opener. I was dragged into it by, young people whose territory I thought it was. And they said, no, it's really just, the new way of meeting people and finding, like-minded people. You don't necessarily need to be looking for a lover. You can be looking for companionship or, just someone to go and see a movie with. And I was skeptical about that. But as soon as I dipped my toe in the water, I found that to be true. There were lots of men. You had to be selective, of course, as you would in any dating situation. But I just found that I was able to strike up conversations, which you initially have by text, with a range of people who I never thought I'd be able to connect with. Like I had interesting conversations with, someone who was a canine dentist. I didn't even know that was a job. I met someone who had been a manager with the Rolling Stones. I met a Swedish journalist who was over in Melbourne, doing a story, and here for a couple of weeks. I had conversations with these people, and they're not the sort of people you would normally run into in your everyday life. And I just sort of thought, well, this is expanding. This is really broadening my scope of, people who are out there. And I started to really, really like it. And apart from that, you do then find someone who you kind of click with and connect with, and the banter becomes really, really addictive. The back and forth and just the sassy banter became something that I really, really enjoyed. And then if you get beyond that, you can meet the person. And I met, as you would know, someone who was in an open relationship. Well, that was my first experience of someone who was in an open relationship. And I was curious. I wanted to know, could you actually make that work? Does jealousy come into it? Do you get protective? Do you tell each other about your outside affairs? It was just fascinating.
So you've gained so much, really, haven't you?
I did. I really did. And I had been in quite a closeted relationship for 25 years where I hadn't felt it, but I realised I was very restricted by that relationship, and restricted in a way that wasn't something that suited me. I had made myself into a different person to make that relationship work. So once I didn't have those restrictions anymore and those boundaries, I was able to, free myself. And I called that part of the book experimentation. And that's exactly what it felt like. I was experimenting with a life that hadn't been, available to me in the time I was married. I really enjoyed it.
And now, how is he travelling? You closed the book with a meeting with him.
That meeting was very important for me because it gave me some perspective and some closure on the relationship, and it allowed me to stop being angry with him. And so I really enjoyed that meeting, and I think that I think he's still happy. He's moved interstate now, and I know he's still with that partner. So I'm kind of hoping that they are happy, and that what he put us through was worthwhile for both him and for me.
And you've found a successful relationship yourself. How is that working out?
Yes, I have. I've found a partner who is not the kind of partner who in my former life I would have been attracted to. I was diabolically attracted to alpha males, the kind of males who would, stand out and, be the life of the party and the most exciting person in the room. I've now found that doesn't work for me. It probably doesn't work for many people, because you are always second banana in those relationships. I've now found out what it's like to have a balanced and equal relationship with a man who truly understands kindness and reciprocity and working together and companionship. And it's that again is an eye opener for me to realize that there can be a relationship where you feel safe and you don't feel like you have to second guess everything that's happening. And there's genuine deep commitment and love there. And that's probably the most amazing thing that's come out of all of this, is to understand at this age what a good relationship looks like and feels like.
So it's almost like a fairy story for older women. And yet it's a true story. What kind of effect has it had on your readers? Have you had much feedback?
Look, I have had a lot of feedback. I've had a lot of feedback from women who say, "Oh, look, you're so right. I've experienced the same thing. I've discovered that there's a life after you think your life is over, that you can repartner, and you can actually repartner with a lot of lessons under your belt. You've learnt a lot, you've matured, you have a much better idea of what you want and who you are." So a lot of women have said to me, "Yep, I get it. I've had the same feeling." Then there have been some who just see it as what you said, a fairy story. They find it very hard to believe. What can I say to that? It's true. It happened for me. It may not happen for everybody. But for me, it was a completely educative experience. And I would hope that people who find themselves in those situations, you know, you can get stuck and you can think this is as good as it gets. But if you can break away from that, or if you can see if it becomes too hard to put up with, then do the brave thing and put yourself out there, because it can be a whole lot better than you think it could be. And women have told me that too. And, you know, a lot of women also have said, you know, I was also terrified of the dating apps, and I just never thought that I would be attractive to anyone again. And of course you are. You are, because I think with age comes, you know, the greatest gift of all, which is confidence and maturity, and the willingness to sort of say it as it is, and, you know, not bullshit anymore.
My feeling reading it too is that not just were the things that you did brave, but actually writing the book must have been quite brave, because you've got all the people in it who are part of your life reading it, and you have been very open about everything that's happened. How has that worked out with your friends and family?
Well, I had my book launch about 3 weeks ago, and, you know, the room was full of people who were my friends and family. And I said, look, this is the most confronting thing for me, because other people have read it. People who I don't know have read it, and that's fine. But now you have to read it, and you're probably going to feel a bit uncomfortable, or may find my honesty a little confronting. But I blamed my editor, because she was in the room too. And I said, my editor was Lee Kaufman, and she just encouraged me always to be as brave and as honest and as brutally unfiltered as I could be, because the unvarnished truth is very compelling. And I don't think I've hurt anybody with what I've revealed. I've outed myself a little too much in the way I've described my sexual encounters, I guess. But, you know, I can deal with that. And all of my friends have been able to deal with how they're represented. The only two people I'm not sure about is my ex-husband and his new partner. I don't even know if they've read the book, but they know of it. And my ex-husband sent me a text and said, good luck at your book launch, and he signed it with the name that I had given him in the book. So I thought that was a pretty good sign.
I think he might have read it.
He probably has.
Jo Peck, her novel Suddenly Single at 60, breaks really new ground in lots of ways.
My name is Samir, and I'm just knocking 50, just 6 months short of that wonderful age. The first book which I read cover to cover was after I had given my year 12 exams. So usually in India what happens is you give your exams and then there is a 2-month layoff. And so in those 2 months I did not have much to do. And that was the first time I read a book. And it was like a book which was lying in the house. Maybe some relative had just brought it from overseas and it was lying like a paperweight. And I thought, let me just give it a shot. And I distinctly and vividly remember the name of the book was Master of the Game by Sidney Sheldon. And it was really interesting for a 17-year-old boy. And it had everything. It had intrigue. It had some interesting episodes. So that got me that reading is not such a bad thing. I think it's akin to drinking. You start with particular kind of drinks and then you gradually move on to very niche kind of drinking. So books as well, there were thrillers and all these fiction books. And slowly I graduated to more research-based, non-fictional books, history. And now, of course, fiction I only read when somebody really recommends and I know that the recommendation is worth it. That's when I pick up a book which is fictional. Otherwise, I generally read non-fiction books now. My favorite fiction book is Les Miserables, and that I read about 3 years back. Thick book. Took me about 6 months to finish, but I'm really in love with that book. it's kind of a tragedy, but it's got such wonderful human qualities in the book, which is about being righteous, character strengths of being righteous, forgiving people, and love. So that's what makes that book stand out from all the fiction books I have read. Non-fiction, it usually happens that you read one non-fiction book about a subject and then you want to read 2-3 books about the same subject from different authors to probably streamline the way you think. But any non-fiction book could be history, could be science-based research. To me, it's such a fabulous thing that 80 years of life can be compressed into one book, and you can learn so much about a person or any research in one book. So that's what I find really fascinating about reading a book. The books by my bed are Cultural Heritage of India. It's a 6-volume set, and it's probably to do with migration. Once you are out of your country, you really want to learn more about the culture, not when you're back there. So that's a pile of book which is just my bedside, and I really want to read it. I think it'll take me about 10-15 years to complete that 6-volume set. Otherwise, presently I'm reading 3 books which are also by my bedside. That's Gabor Mate's The Myth of Normal, Vedanta Treatise, and Evolution of Religions.
Sarah, what are you reading at the moment?
I've read a bit of a bizarre novel lately. It's called The Animals in That Country. Now, it's probably came out in about 2021. So it was my girlfriend just had a pile of books that she had recently read and dropped them on me. So I've just been working through them. It's written by Laura Jean McKay, and it won a bunch of awards. So ABA winner, the Stella Shortlist, the Victorian Premier's Literary Awards. It was really well recognised. It's bizarre, and it's set in a world where it's set from the perspective of a sort of hard-drinking, foul-mouthed grandma called Jean, and she works in a wildlife park. She's never quite got the job as ranger because I think she pushes the boundaries on what she's allowed to do a bit too much. But she forms this really weird symbiotic relationship with a dingo called Sue, and throughout the story you find out that there is a virus affecting the community, and the virus that's affecting the community lets people communicate with animals, and it's odd. It becomes this weird exploration into, if you could hear all of the animals, or just even some groups of animals, what would that experience be like? It would get right into your head. If you heard every insect around you, of the rats in the walls, of the cat on the bench, and you actually knew what they thought of you, especially if you lived in a wildlife park and kept them in cages, or even if you're out in the world and you're sort of wandering through the world. So it's this weird plague that affects the world, and she first starts in a ranger park but then goes and explores it further with a dingo along her side. It's a challenging read because it's interesting, but it also has swaths of dialogue which are written in animal, and they don't always make sense because they're in the nonsensical thought patterns of a dingo or an insect or a rat. And so I found it a challenging book. I haven't quite worked out if I liked it or not, but it was certainly a very, very bizarre and interesting read.
You've got me in. It sounds amazing.
I'll bring it round.
I'm reading something much more conventional. I'm reading Colm Tobin's latest book, which I think, once again, everybody's probably reading, called Long Island, which is a 20-year follow-up to his book Brooklyn, which was a very beloved movie as well as a book. I'm loving it, and I think it's made me think, he's so famous, he doesn't need to worry about finding a publisher, but the number of Irish authors around at the moment, and I'm told that in Ireland you get €50,000 a year if you are a writer. And I think what a wonderful thing that would be of any kind of art. I think we both should definitely move there immediately. I assume you have to prove that you're producing stuff, but nevertheless, just that support of the arts is probably beyond the comprehension of our government. It will be really interesting
to invest in that kind of thought. That kind of capacity to think and create.
And it's producing amazing books. They're
amazing.
lined up. Every award seems to have quite a preponderance of Irish authors.
I wonder what drives that kind of policy making. You know, it would be fascinating to see what goes on behind the scenes and who pushes and where that pressure needs to come from.
An enlightened politician is what we need.
Come on, Australia. We come to the end of our 40th episode and it's been lovely. It's been great to share this with you, our little celebration, but also to have had you along for the ride for 40 episodes. So thanks for joining us today and tune in. We will have many, many more coming your way. I'm Sarah Martin.
And I'm Annie Hastwell.
Thanks for your company.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally, Michaela Andreev,
Sarah Martin.
And me, Annie Hastwell. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast. That's TSUNDOKU Cast.